It was supposed to be a dream trip, just a group of friends heading into the dense jungle of South America for a week of camping. They'd signed up for a guided trek with a local guide, someone who knew the terrain and could help them avoid the dangers that lurked beneath the thick canopy. On the first night, everything was fine. They set up camp near a small clearing, and the night sky was beautiful, the stars piercing through the gaps in the trees. They cooked their dinner over an open fire, laughing and telling stories. The guide, a stoic man named Carlos, didn't say much, but watched the forest with a sharp eye, his movements deliberate, almost cautious. By the second night, the mood had shifted. The sounds of the jungle at night were louder, closer. The chirps of insects felt more like whispers. The winds were different, unnaturally still, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Around the fire, the group tried to brush it off, but even the most hardened of them couldn't ignore the feeling that they weren't alone. Carlos kept his gaze fixed on the trees, occasionally muttering something in Spanish, but the group couldn't catch it. They asked him what was wrong, but he only shook his head, telling them it was nothing to worry about. Around midnight, the first sound came, a low, guttural growl from somewhere deep in the jungle. It wasn't like anything they had heard before, too deep, too unnatural. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up. At first, they thought it was an animal, maybe a jaguar, but it didn't sound like any animal they knew. Carlos stood up abruptly, his face pale. "We need to leave," he said in a low, urgent voice. The group laughed nervously, thinking it was just his superstition, but then they heard it again. Closer this time, the growl, followed by something else, a series of quick, sharp snaps in the underbrush. Like something moving fast, something that shouldn't be able to move so fast in that dense jungle. Carlos turned to them, his voice almost frantic. "Get the gear. Now." They could hear it now, too, the rustling, the snapping, something circling the camp. It was too fast to be a typical jungle predator. It was something bigger, smarter, and it wasn't alone. Panic set in as they gathered their things. In their haste, one of the group, a girl named Maria, tripped and fell to the ground. They turned to help her, but by the time they reached her, the growl was right on top of them. And then the ground beneath them seemed to shift. There was movement under the dirt, as if something large was burrowing toward them from below. Carlos shoved them toward the edge of the camp, his hand shaking. "Move now! It's coming!" They barely made it out of the clearing when they heard the unmistakable sound of tearing, like fabric ripping in the distance. It was a scream, raw, primal, but not from any human throat. Without turning back, they ran through the jungle, the oppressive night pressing in on them, the growls still chasing. Carlos was leading them, but his steps were growing slower. "Stay close," he said, his voice strained. "Don't let it catch you." After what felt like hours, they finally made it to a small river. Carlos collapsed at the bank, out of breath. "It's too late for me," he whispered, his eyes hollow. "It's always too late. You can't outrun it." They watched as Carlos stood slowly, his eyes vacant. The growls had stopped. The jungle had gone silent. Before any of them could react, something huge, something massive, erupted from the undergrowth, a shadow larger than any animal they had seen. It was like a twisted version of a man, long-limbed, with jagged, broken features. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth stretched far too wide, like it had been torn apart and stitched back together. The last thing the group heard before they fled was the sound of Carlos's voice, now twisted, now part of the thing's voice, calling them into the darkness.